Hey there, friend. Before we begin tonight's journey, I recommend finding your most unremarkable blanket, perhaps one with just the faintest scent of laundry and forgotten dreams. Settle in. Take a few long, slow breaths. Maybe dim the lights or listen to a fan hum like a lazy priest chanting about crops. You're about to enter the desert lands of ancient Egypt, but not the pyramid kind. No pharaohs yelling about their legacy. No tomb robbers sprinting dramatically through booby traps. No. This story is about fun. Specifically, the kind of fun that ancient Egyptians had when they weren't farming flax, avoiding hippos, or arguing over how many gods one temple could hold before it felt crowded. This is a story of games, laughter, and dancing, but in a very controlled, polite, dusty sort of way. So now, close your eyes, or don't. Either way, let's begin. Long before there were phones, memes, or that one oddly intense uncle at family board game night, there was Senet. To the untrained eye, Senet might appear as a humble board, a simple rectangle carved with 30 squares and populated with what could easily be mistaken for thimbles or oddly shaped candied olives. But in ancient Egypt, this game was not only the height of leisure, it was also rumored to be spiritually important, slightly frustrating, and an excellent way to avoid chores during mid-afternoon heat. The game was usually played on a board about the size of a narrow cat, perhaps slightly longer, if you owned an ambitious artisan. It was divided into 3 rows of 10 squares, each creating a zigzag pattern that seemed more complex than it needed to be. This, of course, made it ideal for hours of slow-paced entertainment. Players used little tokens, each supposedly representing their soul or fate, or perhaps just their favorite cousin, and moved them around the board according to the results of stick throws. Now, these weren't ordinary sticks. Oh no, these were sacred throwing sticks, flat, curved things that looked like something you might use to stir soup or nudge a sleeping cat. When thrown, they'd land with either the flat side up or down, giving players a number from 1 to 5. There were no dice in Senet, because dice implied chaos, and the Egyptians preferred their unpredictability to come in rectangular wooden form. A typical Senet session went something like this: one person threw the sticks. They moved their piece. They landed on a square. Sometimes the square was nice. Sometimes it sent you back 3 spaces. Sometimes you just sat there until someone remembered whose turn it was. There was strategy involved, to be sure, but also a generous helping of quiet resignation. It was the kind of game where no one really remembered the rules, but everyone agreed that Aunt Nefertari was suspiciously good at it. Most households owned at least one senet board. If you were rich, it was made of polished wood, inlaid with ivory, possibly shaped like a papyrus scroll, curled by the gods themselves. If you were not rich, and most weren't, you scratched the board onto a stone slab, or baked one from mud and hope. Pieces could be anything. Pebbles, bits of pottery, a fig seed carved with a knife someone used for fish earlier that morning. The point was never the equipment. It was the ritual, the slowness, the mutual understanding that the game wasn't really about winning. It was about not having to sweep grain storage or chase a goose into the canal for a while. Senet was also played in the afterlife, according to several tomb paintings, and at least one very confident priest who once declared, "Let he who masters senet never stub his toe again," or something similar. That meant pharaohs were often buried with elaborate boards and perfectly balanced game pieces ready to challenge the gods to a match and possibly win divine favor. Whether the gods played fair is still debated by scholars with too much time and too little sleep. It's worth noting that senet wasn't a loud game. There was no shouting, no victory dancing, and certainly no flipping of boards in anger. That kind of behavior was reserved for goat theft and bad beer. Senet was meditative. Two players hunched over a board, occasionally muttering or ah. On rare occasions, one might even hear, "Well, would you look at that?" if something particularly dramatic occurred, like a piece moving more than 2 squares in one turn. Children learned senet early, though few mastered it before their 6th harvest. It was said to teach patience, wisdom, and how to accept that sometimes the sticks just hate you today. Entire families gathered to play. Sometimes the neighbor joined in. Sometimes they just watched, eyes half-lidded, already halfway to dreamland, as the game plodded gently onward. In temples, senet was viewed as symbolic, a journey of the soul through trials toward enlightenment, or perhaps just a nicely shaded corner with a melon. Each square had meaning. Some protected you. Others delayed you. A few sent you backward in a fit of spiritual mischief. But through it all, players kept playing, because that's what one did. In a land where time was marked by floods, sunrises, and the occasional royal decree, a long, slow game of senet fit right in. By the end of a session, there were rarely winners. Only people who had managed to not lose very badly. The real victory was in staying awake through the 7th round, or not falling asleep on the board itself. And so, dear listener, if your eyes are already drifting shut, if your mind is imagining gently worn wooden pieces inching along a dusty board, while a small breeze ruffles your tunic, congratulations. You've already begun your own spiritual game of Senate. No rush. Take your time. There are 19 more stages to come. For now, let's let the sticks fall where they may. And so, having watched your final Senate piece slide respectfully into its home square, perhaps after an uneventful detour around a tricky misfortune tile, you brush the board clean with a soft cloth or your sleeve, depending on your social status, or how recently you did laundry. And now you look around the modestly shaded courtyard for the next form of amusement. Someone likely your cousin or your cousin's friend, who never quite went home after the last barley harvest, unrolls something round and strange, a coiled shape carved into a thick wooden slab, resembling a snake that made one turn too many and politely decided to stay that way. This is Mayhen, the game of the snake, a pastime not meant for the easily startled or for those who prefer their boards with straight lines and rational geometry, named after the snake god, Mayhen, protector of Ra, as he drifted nightly through the underworld like a divine canoe passenger who refused to paddle. The game bore a mild reputation for mystery, though not enough to discourage idle play on slow afternoons when the Nile flowed a little too quietly and everyone had already discussed the weather, the grain tax, and that one goose who had recently begun attacking sandals. The board was spiral-shaped, coiling inward like a contemplative pastry, with each segment marked by little squares that were probably symbolic, though no one agreed on what they meant. Some claimed they represented stages of life. Others said they stood for different temple rites or moods of the crocodile god Sobek, which ranged from indifferent to mildly annoyed. In practice, the squares were simply there to move pieces along, and if any metaphysical insight occurred while doing so well, that was a bonus. Players used lion or lioness-shaped tokens because nothing says casual board game like tiny predators slowly encircling a serpent. The movement of pieces was often decided by throwing knuckle bones or flat stones, not unlike those used in Senate, though slightly more unpredictable, particularly when thrown indoors, and one got lost under the rush, matting, never to be seen again, except by ants. The rules of Mayhen, truth be told, are something of a historical shrug. Modern scholars have debated them for decades, referencing tomb paintings, surviving fragments, and one particularly enthusiastic statue that may or may not be mid-game. But in ancient times, much like today's family card nights, everyone simply agreed to a loose set of house rules, adjusted frequently to benefit whoever had brought the figs. The basic idea was clear enough. Get your lion from the outer coils of the serpent to its calm, unblinking center, then escape back out without being caught or metaphorically digested. It's the sort of objective that sounds easier than it is, particularly after a goblet of date wine and a few generous spoonfuls of lentil mash. Games of Mehen unfolded at a dignified pace. Not slow per se, but deliberate, like a story told by someone who enjoys remembering the color of the sky before mentioning who actually walked into the room. There was occasional laughter, usually when a lion piece tumbled off the board and landed in someone's sandal, and rare expressions of triumph, often whispered so as not to disturb the household goat, who considered loud celebration a personal insult. Unlike Senet Mehen, could involve more than 2 players, which made it ideal for larger gatherings such as evening temple picnics or funerals where the mood was heavy, but not entirely without room for distraction. Sometimes the priest would play. Sometimes even the grandmother, who hadn't walked more than 3 feet in a decade, would lean in finger, hovering over the coiled path, debating which lion to move, and whether it was worth the risk of being mocked by a nephew. The most skilled Mehen players weren't necessarily the smartest or fastest, but those with a strong tolerance for repetition and an ability to recall which lion had already circled the 6th loop without asking. It was considered impolite to fall asleep during a game, but not uncommon. The serpent's coil had a hypnotic quality, especially under the sun's warm press or the gentle flicker of a rush lamp at night. Stories tell of entire games paused for naps, then resumed 2 hours later with minimal confusion, save for one incident where the board had been slightly rotated and the lions found themselves moving in reverse for an hour before someone noticed. The strategic depth of Mehen, like its serpent-shaped board, was deceptive. At first, it seemed simple move and avoid other players' retreat. But then you found yourself cornered by another lion. Or one of the middle squares suddenly became dangerous based on a rule someone remembered from last harvest. Or a bird landed on the board, and a brief but spirited debate erupted over whether it had pecked a piece into a different square on purpose. Every move, every choice carried the quiet weight of possibility. Nothing urgent, just gently significant. Like deciding whether to sit in the sun or shade, or whether the jug of water was still cool enough to drink without wrinkling your nose. To lose at Mehen was not shameful. To win was not particularly glorious. The true goal, as with most things in ancient Egypt, was balance, harmony, mat, and perhaps the satisfaction of having moved your lion with some dignity, not knocking over your neighbor's piece or sneezing on the board. As the day wore on and shadows lengthened like papyrus scrolls unrolling across the courtyard floor, The game continued in soft murmurs. The serpent's head loomed silently at the center of the board, ever watching, never judging. The lions paced with careful consideration. And somewhere in the distance, a musician tuned his lyre for what promised to be a very slow, slightly out-of-tune performance in the next chapter of this gentle tale, where music movement and faintly alarming dance rituals take the stage not with flair, but with firmly planted sandals and extremely modest hip motions, as the last lion token padded its way off the coiled mehen board, and someone finally stood to stretch the stiffness from their knees with the quiet satisfaction of a game nearly remembered and mostly understood. The late afternoon warmth turned the air syrupy and soft, like date syrup, left too long in a sunlit jar, and a small gathering began to form near the outer edge of the courtyard, where flat sandals shuffled dust into polite little clouds. This was not a festival, not officially, nor a ceremony of great political weight, but rather something in between, a neighborhood offering of movement and music, a way to coax time forward, gently, step by step, sway by sway, with the sort of deliberate grace only possible when nothing urgently needed doing, and the sun was still high enough to cast shadows, but not low enough to suggest dinner. A group of women emerged first, their linen dresses slightly creased from sitting too long, but still fluttering faintly in the breeze, like dignified sails on a lazy boat. One wore a headdress with what might once have been a fresh lotus, now politely wilted, but still fragrant, while another tapped a sistrum, a metal rattle shaped like a temple gate, more symbolic than melodic, though its soft jingling did lend the air a ceremonial shimmer. These were temple dancers, or perhaps merely dancers who occasionally appeared near temples and had learned to bow in rhythm. Either way, they moved with a fluidity that suggested practice, but not performance. This was not dancing to impress. It was dancing to continue. Their arms lifted slowly, not above the head, but to the side, as though cradling something invisible and slightly judgmental, like a sacred cat or a half-full jar of honey. Hips shifted, not with abandon, but with careful calculation, not unlike a cautious potter adjusting a wheel that has begun to wobble. A drum began soft, at first, a dull thump that echoed slightly against the sun-baked walls of nearby houses. It was joined by a long-necked lute, played by a man who looked as though he had been born mid-pluck and had never stopped. The melody wandered without urgency, pausing often, as if checking to make sure the breeze was still cooperative. Children too young to understand symbolism, but old enough to mimic shoulder rolls, began to sway clumsily nearby their movements, enthusiastic, but narratively disjointed. The dancers allowed it. This was not a stage. It was a moment. In ancient Egypt, dance was many things: a form of worship, a form of mourning, a way to express joy, and occasionally a method of distracting someone from noticing their lentils were burning. Dances had names, though no one here recited them aloud. There was the Dance of the Fertile Reed, usually performed near harvest time and involving slow circling, like a crocodile in a philosophical mood. There was the Opening of the Mouth movement sequence, used in funerary rites to convince statues to breathe metaphorically, though on warm days it was hard to say who was trying to revive whom. And then there were dances for Hathor, goddess of joy, music, motherhood, and other mildly overwhelming things. Her dances were meant to be ecstatic, but here in the courtyard, they were more contemplative, more of a serene nod toward ecstasy than a full embrace of it. The dancers twirled once carefully, so as not to disturb the bowl of figs resting near the incense burner. An elder sat nearby, tapping a stick in time with the drum, though it was unclear whether he was keeping rhythm or simply discouraging ants from his robe. A girl passed around a tray of dates dusted with ground acacia, the kind that sticks slightly to your fingers and gives you something to focus on when the conversation slows. The sistrum jingled again, just once, then fell silent, allowing a reed flute to fill the space with a high, breathy sigh that might have been a melody, or might have been the sound of the musician remembering a better one. It didn't matter. The point was the doing. Movement in ancient Egypt was never wasted, but it was rarely rushed. Whether guiding the spirit of the deceased toward the western horizon, or welcoming a neighbor's first grandchild with a three-step shuffle and an offering of perfumed oil dance, was always intentional. Even the awkward dances at wedding feasts, where uncles made strong choices and regrettable gestures, carried the weight of tradition. To dance was to align yourself with the rhythms of the cosmos, or at the very least, with the percussionist's slow and slightly uneven beat. A hawk circled overhead, briefly distracting one of the children, who paused mid-spin to point, and then forgot what dance he was doing entirely. The others didn't notice. The dancers continued, arms rising again, fingers soft, ankles steady. No one clapped. Applause wasn't really a thing yet. Instead, there was the quiet approval of sustained attention, the respectful silence of a shared moment being allowed to stretch comfortably like a cat on a warm brick. Somewhere behind the house, a goat bleated, once either in appreciation or hunger. It was hard to tell with goats. A man leaned forward to adjust the tilt of a ceramic pitcher so it wouldn't catch the wind and tip, and then sat back without a word. Another slow turn from the dancers, this time in near unison, like reeds swaying in a shared memory of wind. The drum thudded again, a bit more firmly this time, like a polite reminder that evening was not far off. Shadows had begun to lean, stretching from doorway to doorway, like long-legged servants, checking whether anyone needed more shade. The air thickened slightly, rich with the smell of crushed mint and sandalwood smoke. And just as the dancers began a new phrase, arms folding, hips swaying in gentle alternation, heads tilting toward some imagined horizon. A rustle near the edge of the gathering signaled the arrival of something different, something familiar, yet oddly structured, like a game or ritual, or both, involving bowls, reeds, and possibly the throwing of objects with no clear scoring system. Because the next chapter of our story does not lie in dance, but in the curious communal joy of ancient party games that were neither fast nor especially fair, but perfect for passing time until the moon decided it was fully awake. As the dancers swayed into stillness, and the final notes of the flute dissolved into the thickening dusk like perfumed smoke, deciding to take a nap. The gathered neighbors shifted with the slow precision of people who had nowhere pressing to be easing onto mats, low stools, and one particularly cooperative pile of woven baskets, as if settling in for the next chapter of the evening's gentle momentum. There was no announcement, no formal cue, just the subtle choreography of expectation, as someone, perhaps a cousin again, or maybe the boy who always carried things and sometimes dropped them, appeared with a shallow clay bowl filled with smooth stones. Each one selected not for significance, but for the simple fact that it was small, round, and satisfying to hold. The bowl was placed at the center of a cleared space, and immediately 4 or 5 others leaned forward, not in competition, but in curiosity, the way one might gather around a sleeping cat that has just made a mysterious noise. This was a game. Certainly, though, whether it had a name was uncertain. In ancient Egypt, many amusements were passed down through motion rather than vocabulary, explained not with rules, but with gestures, facial expressions, and the occasional light shove of encouragement. The game, as it slowly unfolded, seemed to involve the tossing of pebbles into various zones of a marked-off area, perhaps drawn hastily in the dust with a stick, perhaps already etched faintly into the courtyard floor from years of repetition. Some claimed the markings represented the Nile's journey from source to delta. Others insisted they were just squares and circles placed wherever someone had dropped a bowl last year. Regardless, The rules were understood by those who played often and accepted vaguely by those who didn't. Each player took a turn selecting a pebble, holding it in one hand, while gently waving the other, as though negotiating with unseen forces or trying to shake sand from their sleeve. Then came the toss, not high, never dramatic, but low and deliberate, like offering something to the ground and hoping it accepts. The goal was to land the stone in a specific section without touching any of the others, or perhaps to nudge one aside just so, or maybe to knock your own previous stone closer to the imaginary goal line that someone's aunt insisted existed. The game required dexterity memory and a sense of humor about ambiguity. It also required patience, as each turn was observed with the solemn interest of a courtroom scribe, and any particularly good or unfortunate outcome was met not with cheers or groans, but with the occasional nod, a soft or, if truly notable, a second nod. Spectators leaned in, some chewing quietly on roasted lupin seeds, others gently fanning themselves with palm fronds, not because they were warm, but because it gave their hands something to do. Children imitated the players from the sidelines, tossing imaginary stones at imaginary targets, and then congratulating themselves regardless of where it landed. It was a game of presence, of focus, without urgency, of measuring time, not in points scored, but in shared pauses, and the way people shifted their weight from one knee to the other without ever standing up. Sometimes a reed hoop was brought out, placed upright in the sand, and used as a target for throwing sticks, short, slightly crooked, and chosen from the same pile used earlier for fire starting. The hoop swayed in the breeze occasionally, toppling and being reset with a sigh that suggested this was part of the challenge. Other games involved guessing, like who was hiding the bit of date paste under which shell, though it wasn't always clear whether anyone actually knew the answer, including the person doing the hiding. One particularly slow variation involved balancing a bowl of sand on one's head and walking in a straight line across the courtyard without spilling a task made no easier by the family goat deciding the bowl might be edible and requiring gentle distraction via fig branch. These amusements were not scored, not tallied, and certainly not concluded with prizes. The reward was the playing itself, the shared space, the soft hum of conversation weaving between turns, and the way the fading light made everything look a little more golden and a little less dusty. An elder began telling a story between turns, not a dramatic tale of gods or heroes, but one about a neighbor who had once tried to play this very game using figs instead of stones, and ended up with a bowl full of bees. Laughter rippled gently through the group, not loud, but genuine, like linen fluttering on a line in a lazy wind as the night crept in, and lamps were lit, one by one, casting flickering shadows that made the game board seem like it was slowly evaporating. The stones were gathered once more, returned to the bowl with care as though they might be needed again before the moon reached its peak. The players stretched slowly, joints cracking like old reeds, and looked toward the cluster of musicians, now tuning their instruments again, suggesting that perhaps the night would soon lean toward songs, soft ones, about fishing, or waiting, or a very long caravan that never arrived, the kind that required only a few notes and a memory or two. But before the first string could be plucked, someone produced a different kind of object from a basket tucked under the bench. Something round, slightly flattened, with the unmistakable scent of honey and fried flour, and the room shifted again with the anticipatory quiet of people who knew they were about to share something sweet, something made to be eaten while still warm. And so the next part of the evening began not with music, not with more pebbles, but with the humble arrival of what might just have been the ancient Egyptian version of dessert, as the last of the game pebbles settled back into their bowl, like tiny exiles, returning from a campaign against gravity and uneven dirt. All eyes, or at least the more awake ones, shifted toward the shallow basket, now cradled in the lap of a man best known for two things: his unusually large ears and his wife's skill with fritters. The basket lined with a cloth that had once been blue, but had since faded into the universal beige of well-used linen, gave off a faintly sticky aroma, something sweet and familiar, like sun-warmed syrup mingled with crushed herbs, and a hint of char that suggested the fire had briefly gotten too ambitious. Inside were small golden-brown rounds, not uniform, but clearly intentional, each one roughly the size of a palm, slightly puffed and glistening in the fading light, with either oil honey or some third ingredient no one dared name. These were honey cakes, or possibly date cakes, or perhaps even fig paste fritters, depending on what the household had left over and how creative the cook had felt earlier that afternoon. In truth, no one cared much about the recipe. The important part was that they were warm, edible, and best consumed in multiples. The basket was passed with care, though not particularly quickly. Each person who received it took their time selecting a piece, turning it over, as though examining a small relic, or deciding whether it might secretly contain a nut. Biting into one was an act of quiet ceremony. The outer crust crackled faintly, while the inside offered the kind of soft resistance that suggested it had seen things, flour sifted with a carved shell. Sweet mash stirred with a stick last used for stirring lentil stew oil heated in a clay pan over a fire that insisted on being both helpful and a little wild. The flavor was simple, but layered grain fruit, something spiced, and something else that might have just been smoke. Children took theirs with 2 hands, gripping tightly, lest a precious crumb fall and attract attention from the courtyard chickens who had developed an unholy interest in pastries. One elderly woman claimed hers was too hot and placed it gently on her knee to cool where it remained, untouched, until her niece leaned over and quietly ate it when she wasn't looking. No one said anything. These cakes were not luxury. They weren't made from imported cinnamon or wrapped in gold leaf, nor were they reserved for feast days or temple offerings. They were comfort, plain, and round fried in pig fat or goose drippings, or perhaps just leftover oil strained through yesterday's bread. They were the kind of treat you made when the fruit was overripe, the flour slightly clumpy, and the sun too high for ambitious cooking. A few people discussed methods. One man said his mother used to dip the cakes in palm syrup after frying, not before, to keep them from getting soggy. Another swore by stuffing them with crushed nuts, though no one had seen a walnut in 3 seasons. And the last attempt at pistachios had ended with a cracked tooth and mild legal threats. The point was not innovation. It was repetition, making the same sweet thing the same way year after year until it became a family shape. Somewhere in the middle of this slow communion of pastry and size, a younger man with a reed stylus behind one ear suggested adding fermented date mash to the batter. Everyone ignored him. The cakes were eaten one by one, slowly, some chewed, some nibbled at, with the caution of someone unsure if their molar had fully recovered from last winter. Crumbs fell. Birds hovered. Someone laughed for no reason anyone could explain. The moon, rising now above the flat edge of a nearby wall, cast a pale curve of light across the ground, illuminating the sticky fingers of a boy who had taken 3 cakes instead of 2, and was pretending the 3rd one was for his sister, who had already fallen asleep. Somewhere a jar was opened, and the scent of fermented pomegranate floated through the air, sharp, sour sweet, and strong enough to make at least one person blink twice and decide against a second sip. With bellies beginning to hum softly, and the night air cooling into something that could almost be described as pleasant, the gathering shifted again, as gatherings tend to do, from food to stories, from movement to stillness, from pebbles to people. Someone suggested a tale, not a formal myth with gods and lessons, but a personal account, a memory shaped like a story and delivered with enough pauses to count as entertainment. The suggestion was met with the kind of quiet enthusiasm that sounded like agreement if you leaned in far enough. The cakes were now mostly gone. The basket sat empty, except for one final piece, slightly darker than the others, resting like an afterthought or a dare. No one reached for it yet. Perhaps it was being saved. Perhaps it would become the subject of a wager, or a bribe, or a philosophical discussion on whether the last one always tastes sweeter, or simply lonelier. A man cleared his throat, not dramatically, just enough to suggest he might be the next speaker. His voice was steady low, and perfectly suited for a night like this, warm, a little dusty, and meandering. He began not with once upon a time, but with it might have happened this way, which in ancient Egyptian was the standard preamble for a tale that was going to take its time getting to the point. His hands rested on his knees. The basket remained untouched, and as the first sentence of his story unfolded like a slow breeze across a basket of grain, the listeners settled deeper into their mats, their cloaks, their half-finished thoughts, preparing themselves for a tale of something small and strange, perhaps involving a boat or a monkey or a fish that refused to be eaten. Whatever it was, it would not be told quickly. It would unfold like a papyrus scroll, with a slight crease smoothed out carefully, word by word, and soon, very soon, we will follow it into the odd elliptical heart of an Egyptian anecdote that may or may not involve a festival, a priest with a limp, and a lesson about never lending your sandals to a stranger. It began, as many such stories do, with a morning that was neither particularly hot nor especially cool, the kind of morning where the sun arrives on time, but doesn't seem to be in a hurry, and the dust settles politely without clinging to the edges of one's robe. And in that kind of morning, a priest, small of stature, round of shoulder, and known to limp slightly more on days ending in the letter K, set out from his modest quarters behind the temple granary, carrying a basket of dried onions, and wearing, as fate would have it, the wrong pair of sandals. They weren't bad sandals, mind you. In fact, they were rather fine, with woven straps made from palm fiber that had not yet unraveled, and soles that showed only minimal wear, but they were not his sandals. They belonged to his cousin, a man named Hemu, who had spent the previous evening speaking too loudly about ducks, and had removed his shoes near the incense burner in an act of spiritual spontaneity. The priest, who was called Hekanacht, though few ever pronounced it correctly, had found them that morning, and not feeling particularly particular, slipped them on without looking. This was, he would later claim, the beginning of everything. Now, Hekanacht was not a man prone to adventure. His duties consisted mostly of stirring pots of sacred beer, measuring barley in units that were probably approximate, and nodding solemnly during ceremonies that were too long for anyone to remember in full. But on this day, as he walked along the edge of the canal with the basket of onions swinging gently from one hand, and a vague sense of mischief clinging to his heels, something unusual occurred. A fish large and suspiciously symmetrical leapt from the water with what could only be described as intent. It did not land back in the water. Instead, it flopped dramatically onto the path where it proceeded to make eye contact with Hekanacht in a way that suggested it had something to say. Naturally, the priest stopped. One does not ignore an expressive fish, particularly when wearing borrowed footwear. The fish still flapping, but with an air of deliberation, appeared to be mouthing words. Hekanacht, who had once memorized a full hymn about birds simply to win a bet, leaned in. He heard nothing. The fish flopped again this time, nudging the edge of a small stone tablet, half buried in the mud. It was at this point that Hekanacht, who was not easily impressed, but had eaten very little that morning, decided the fish was clearly trying to communicate the location of a hidden message, perhaps from the gods, or possibly from a local fisherman with a flair for drama. He dropped the onion basket, crouched awkwardly due to the sandals, and retrieved the tablet. It was blank. He turned it over. Still blank. The fish blinked, gave one final spasm of effort, and stopped moving entirely, as though having delivered its message, it had nothing further to offer. A boy nearby, who had been watching while chewing on a stick that might once have been sugarcane, shouted, "Hey! That's my fish." Hekanacht stood, looked down at the sandals, and then at the fish, and then at the boy. "Do you often receive messages from your seafood?" he asked. The boy shrugged. "Sometimes they just jump out. It's the heat." This explanation was not helpful. The priest tucked the blank tablet into his sleeve, retrieved the onions, and continued on his way. Though now he walked a little faster, which was difficult, given the limp and the sandals, which had begun to squeak in an unholy way. He arrived at the temple kitchen only slightly later than expected, and explained the fish incident to no one, as it did not seem immediately relevant to the preparation of leeks in sour beer. But he kept the tablet. That evening, he showed it to his cousin Hemu, who was still barefoot and still talking about ducks. "Your sandals," Hekanacht said, pointing. "They make fish speak." Hemu examined the tablet, licked it once for reasons unknown, and declared, "This is not fish-related. It's soapstone, probably meant for carving or skipping." He tried to skip skip it across the surface of the water jar. It sank. The matter, like many things in temple life, was left unresolved. But rumors began. A priest seen communing with fish. A boy claiming his dinner predicted omens. A basket of onions found with one mysteriously missing. Hekanakut's limp grew slightly more pronounced, though whether from divine burden or sandal chafing, no one could say. Eventually, the blank tablet was used as a doorstop. The fish cooked in lentils and eaten without further incident became a footnote in a story that was told more often than it was believed. And yet, late at night, when the candles flickered just so, some swore they could still hear the faint slap of wet scales on packed earth, and the whisper of sandals that had walked in the wrong direction for just long enough to find something odd. Back in the courtyard, the storyteller paused here, his voice trailing off like incense smoke curling toward the rafters, and for a long moment no one spoke. The fire crackled. A bird chirped, then reconsidered. Someone shifted on a reed mat. Finally, a woman leaned forward and said, "But what about the goat, the one from the festival?" And the storyteller nodded slowly, as if he had been waiting for that question all along, and began again, his voice dipping slightly, the tone changing from curious to conspiratorial, because the goat, as it turned out, had not only eaten the fig offerings meant for Hathor, but had also developed a talent for escaping locked pens. And the next chapter, the next winding stretch of this sleepy tale, was about to follow a trail of hoofprints into the soft, hay-scented chaos of a temple celebration undone by a very determined animal. It began as many inconvenient episodes do, with a small oversight and a large goat. The festival of Hathor had come again, as it reliably did every year, when the river leaned just far enough from flood to let sandals reach the temple steps without floating, and when the air turned thick with bees and wine in equal measure. This particular festival was dedicated, as usual, to music joy and offerings of sweet things, primarily figs, dates, and small cakes shaped like lions, though the lions rarely looked intentional. The courtyard had been swept garlands of faded flowers, hung with more optimism than color, and the priestesses had set out trays of fruit beside reed altars, their hands sticky with syrup, and the kind of flour that refuses to stay on the cakes, and instead becomes a light dusting on every surface, sacred or otherwise. Now the goat in question, known to some as Ket, and to others less kindly as that beast, was not officially part of the temple, nor was it clear who had first brought it, or why it continued to be tolerated. Some said it had wandered in during a particularly rainy festival 3 years prior and had simply never left. Others claimed it was a divine gift from a minor god of mischief and manure. It was large-horned and had eyes that gave the distinct impression it was planning something. On the morning of the festival, Ket had been secured, or so it was believed, in the side pen near the herb garden, tied to a post with a length of rope that had once been used to moor a barge, but now held less dignity. Unfortunately, the rope had recently been nibbled at by temple mice who had taken a liking to its salt-crusted fibers, and when the breeze picked up just enough to flap the linen banners with a festive rustle, the rope gave one final heroic twitch and then surrendered entirely. Ket released from bondage, and with no interest in the subtleties of reverence, ambled directly toward the fig offerings. The first tray was consumed with the speed of divine wrath. The second was trampled in what could only be described as a celebratory stomp. A priestess screamed. A young acolyte tried to intervene using a broom and a firm voice, but was immediately knocked sideways into a jar of barley mash. The goat, emboldened, leapt onto the low altar platform and stood there, chewing a floral garland and gazing serenely over the crowd, as if considering a sermon. The musicians, who had just begun a cautious rendition of the hymn of pleasant sounds, faltered. The drummer tapped a few uncertain beats. The sistrum rattler froze mid-rattle. The dancers trained for disruption, but not barnyard chaos, continued swaying in place, hoping to be mistaken for decorative statues. The head priestess, a woman named Toddy, with a voice like oiled linen, and the patience of someone who once waited 2 years for a papyrus shipment, arrived on the scene and immediately assessed the situation with a single blink. Again, she said not loudly, but with the weight of annual experience, "Someone bring the cart." The cart in question was a small wooden platform on wheels, originally designed to carry ceremonial jars, but frequently repurposed for moving reluctant animals. It was pulled into place by 2 sweating attendants, while Ket, still chewing, climbed down from the altar and trotted briskly away, not in fear, but with the air of someone late for a second appointment. A chase began. Not a fast one, as most of the temple staff were wearing their festival sandals, which prioritized ornamentation over speed, and several had been fasting since dawn. Ket led them through the herb garden into the pottery yard, briefly through the sleeping quarters, where a novice was startled into chanting half a psalm, and finally back into the main courtyard, where he paused, turned, and deposited something unmentionable onto a cushion intended for offerings. It was at this precise moment, as several priests debated the theological implications of goat-related desecration that the storyteller in the courtyard paused his tale long enough to sip water from a cup shaped like a fish and wipe his brow with a motion that suggested both modesty and dramatic timing. Around him, the listeners leaned in, not because they were surprised. A goat interrupting a religious observance was more common than one might think, but because they wanted to know how it ended, or at least who cleaned the cushion. A boy, wide-eyed and sticky, with leftover honey cake, whispered, "Did they sacrifice it?" and was promptly shushed by his grandmother, who insisted the goat was blessed, and possibly an incarnation of something that didn't like being tied up. The storyteller smiled slightly and continued. Ket, he explained, was eventually cornered behind the granary by an elderly cook armed with a ladle and a handful of dried lentils. Rather than resist, the goat lay down, exhaled heavily, and began chewing the lentils, one by one. He was loaded onto the cart, rolled back into the courtyard, and placed near the altar as if nothing had happened. The offerings were hastily rearranged. The cushion was removed and discreetly buried. The festival resumed, albeit with a slightly different mood. The prayers took on a tone of appeasement. The songs were a little more hurried. The fig trays were guarded by 2 novices with long sticks. Ket remained on his cart, occasionally standing to bleat during particularly solemn chants, which led to quiet speculation that perhaps Hathor herself approved of the disruption. No divine sign confirmed this unless one counts the brief shower of petals that fell from a garland just as Ket sneezed. The storyteller paused again, this time not for effect, but because someone had brought out a small jar of date wine, and it was being passed with the casual reverence reserved for festival leftovers. As he sipped, he glanced toward the fire where the embers glowed like patient stars, and murmured that the story was not quite over, because in the days that followed the festival, a new problem emerged, quiet at first, and then louder, involving a missing scroll, an unfortunate misunderstanding about whose sandals were whose again, and a rumor that the temple's fish pond, once blessed and clear, had turned an odd shade of green, possibly due to something dropped in it during the goat incident. And so, with the wine warming his voice and the fire crackling just so, the storyteller leaned forward and promised to explain how a sacred document was accidentally used as kindling, why the temple cook refused to serve lentils for a full moon cycle, and what became of the goat's mysterious stare that seemed to follow one particular priest all the way into his dreams. In the quiet haze that followed the goat's festival debut, as garlands wilted and fig trays were licked suspiciously clean, the temple grounds returned to their usual rhythm. Not fast, not particularly efficient, but steady, like a pot simmering over a low flame that never quite boils. Yet even amid this familiar slowness, a new ripple of confusion began to spread, starting, as these things often do, with a scroll that no one could find, and a priest who had not slept properly since the goat made eye contact with him during the hymn of sacred joy. The scroll in question was not just any scroll, but a particularly dull one. An inventory list of temple linens, oil jars, grain stores, and the mysterious entry misc. Brass items, which no one had ever managed to define, but which recurred in every list since the reign of Thutmose, the slightly overwhelmed. It was stored, theoretically, in the archive chamber, beneath the incense storeroom, a space known for its uneven, floor-damp corners, and a population of mice so scholarly they occasionally nested inside hollowed-out scroll tubes. When the head scribe, a man named Dedu, who wore his reed stylus tucked behind his ear with the seriousness of a general, went to retrieve the scroll for routine recopying, he found the shelf empty and the small clay tablet that usually labeled the section replaced with a shard that read, "Only hot coal" in someone's hurried script. This alone might not have caused alarm, but when he asked around, a cook mentioned that during the festival, someone had taken an old piece of writing from the kindling pile to start the ceremonial brazier. At the time, it had been raining slightly, and dry materials were in short supply. The scroll, it seemed, had gone up in sacred smoke, possibly blessing the air with precise counts of barley jars and apron cords. While the scroll itself was gone, the greater mystery and concern was what this had to do with Nesyamun, a junior priest recently promoted to keeper of the south wall. Candles, a position prestigious, mostly for the hat it involved. Since the festival, Nesyamun had been acting oddly. He had taken to walking in circles near the fish pond, muttering about goat eyes and misplaced firewood. He claimed to dream of hoofbeats on wet stone, of vegetables bleeding, of the temple floor rising beneath him like a wave. Several nights in a row, he had been found standing barefoot in the courtyard, with one sandal in his hand, and a look that suggested he was about to recite poetry, but had forgotten all known words. The fish pond itself had not helped matters. Once clear and still, it had taken on a strange hue, greenish, but not the comforting kind associated with algae or frog spawn. This green had depth. It seemed to swirl even when the air was still. And on more than one occasion, it had emitted a sound, a low, slow gurgle that did not coincide with wind or rainfall, but with moments of particular silence, like the pause before a priest began a chant, or the hush when someone realized they had lost their sandals. again. Tadi, the head priestess, maintained that the pond was fine, that the color was due to ceremonial herbs washed into it accidentally, and that the gurgling was a perfectly natural aquatic burping phenomenon. Still, she began lighting extra incense near its edge, and assigned 2 novices to monitor it discreetly during daylight hours. The scroll was rewritten from memory, though every version contained different numbers of lantern wicks, and none could agree on whether the extra jars of sesame oil were real or a metaphor. Meanwhile, Nessiamun's sleepwalking grew more elaborate. One night, he was found attempting to climb the offering platform while whispering a recipe for lentil stew backwards. Another time, he had rearranged the temple sandals by color, which might have been helpful if anyone remembered what color theirs had originally been. Eventually, a visiting healer was consulted. She arrived with a bundle of dried herbs, a bundle of fresh herbs, and a very old turtle, which she placed near the fish pond as a sort of spiritual buffer. She examined Nessiamun by tapping lightly on his forehead and asking him to describe his most vivid dream, to which he replied, "I am the goat. The goat is me. And we both dislike figs now." This was considered insightful, though not diagnostically helpful. She prescribed nightly foot soaks, a special sleep chant involving 6 different vowels and avoidance of all foods, beginning with the sound kh. Improvements were minimal. One evening, after a particularly dramatic gurgle from the pond, Nessiamun declared he had solved the mystery. He stood on a stool during evening meal and announced that the scroll had not been burned, but had transformed spiritually into the goat itself, and that all future temple inventory must now be communicated through bleats and hoofprints. The stool wobbled. He stepped down. No one argued, but that night the scroll keeper added extra clay labels to every shelf, just in case. Meanwhile, Ket the goat continued to live nearby, tethered slightly farther from the temple than before, but still close enough to be seen watching the pond with what many now described as knowing amusement. He refused to eat figs. He responded only to the voice of Nessiamun, who occasionally recited the missing scroll aloud from memory just to keep it alive, or possibly to appease the spirit of misplaced documentation. The pond gurgled less frequently now, though it remained an object of quiet fascination. Visitors were told not to throw anything in, not because it was forbidden, but because it was impolite to provoke whatever lived or thought in its depth. And so the days settled again into their usual rhythm, albeit slightly adjusted, as temple life always did, with one eye on the rituals, one foot in someone else's sandal, and one ear tuned to the soft sloshing of a pond that once knew a goat and a scroll, and perhaps a great deal more, if only it could speak. But before that mystery could be fully dismissed or resolved, a new arrival entered the courtyard. An old traveler with a dusty robe, a flute case, and a tale about the Nile, itself remembering dreams. And as the storyteller leaned forward once more to describe the slow voyage of a musical boat that played lullabies to crocodiles, the listeners shifted again, preparing to drift into a story older than the sandals they wore. The old traveler, who arrived just as the moon brushed the courtyard's edge like a sleepy coin rolling to a stop, said little at first, beyond a soft grunt and a polite cough that sounded rehearsed, as though meant to announce his presence without interrupting the natural rhythm of the fire's crackle and the pond's occasional gurgle. His robe was the color of forgotten linen, dust soft and wrinkled in the shape of someone who had once leaned against too many baskets, and he carried no visible belongings save for a case made of polished wood and bound in twine, slightly too long to be a scroll, and not quite heavy enough to hold anything practical. The storyteller, who had paused just long enough to sip water and rearrange his cloak to a more dramatic drape, raised an eyebrow and gestured with the tip of his sandal. "Flute?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. The old traveler nodded. Once sat with the deliberate slowness of someone familiar with uneven floors, and placed the case across his knees as if it contained something temperamental. "This," he said eventually, tapping the case with one curled finger, once played a tune that made a crocodile close its eyes and float downstream for an entire afternoon. The listeners, now well trained in the art of not reacting too quickly, responded with a series of soft sounds, a hum here, a murmur there, a shifting of weight that implied both interest and mild skepticism, where someone asked not loudly. "Near Abu," the traveler replied, as though that clarified everything. He opened the case with 2 slow turns of the clasp and revealed a flute carved from dark reed, polished to a sheen that caught the firelight and threw it back in sleepy streaks across his hands. It happened when the Nile ran particularly high, but lazy. He continued not the rushing sort of high, just enough to make boats forget which direction they meant to float. The tale, as he unfolded it, was less a story and more a series of gentle events tied together by rhythm rather than urgency. He had been younger then, though not by much, playing the flute for ferry passengers who didn't care for singing, but liked to hear something between naps. One afternoon, with the sun stretching every shadow to its thinnest, he had begun a tune. Nothing special, just a scale inverted and softened at the ends when a crocodile surfaced beside the boat. It did not charge, nor blink, nor open its mouth. It simply rose its head level with the reeds and stared at him in that ancient, unmoving way only crocodiles and stone door guardians can manage. Instinct told him to stop playing, but the passengers, half asleep and fanning themselves with flat bread, insisted he continue. So he did. The crocodile blinked once slowly and began to sway, not side to side, but in a subtle up and down rhythm that matched the boat's lazy bobbing. Then it closed its eyes. This was notable. Crocodiles do not usually close their eyes unless they are attempting digestion, divine communion, or sleep, and no one was sure which this was. The boat drifted. The flute played. The crocodile floated beside them for what felt like hours, and no one said a word, not out of fear, but out of something else, reverence perhaps, or the desire not to wake whatever dream the animal was having. The traveler paused here to sip his own water, then continued. Eventually, the boat reached a bend in the river where the reeds grew thicker, and the current decided to assert itself just enough to nudge them ashore. The crocodile blinked, again turned, and vanished beneath the surface with a ripple so smooth it could have been silk. The tune ended. The passengers applauded politely, one of them offering him a dried fig and a nod of appreciation, though neither gesture seemed quite sufficient. Since then, the flute had held that memory, or perhaps the river had, and the flute simply echoed it when the wind was just right. "Play it now," someone whispered, and the traveler raised the flute, but did not yet play. "This tune is not for every evening," he said. "It's for when the river forgets what time it is, when the air holds still, like a breath halfway between stories, when you can hear not just the water, but the memory of water." The listeners nodded some more than once. One child, half asleep, whispered, "I think the pond remembers," which earned a sideways glance from the pond itself, or perhaps a small bubble, which in either case was considered confirmation. The traveler, after another pause, played a single note, low curved, and barely there. It lingered, not like a sound, but like the thought of a sound. Then another softer still. No melody, just fragments, the kind of notes that might attract a feather or lull a bird already resting to stay a little longer. No crocodiles appeared, but a moth did spiral gently near the flute's end, landing briefly before fluttering away like a forgotten punctuation mark. The pond gurgled. The wind shifted just enough to lift the edge of someone's tunic. The moon, now higher, seemed to reflect slightly off the traveler's bald head, giving him an unintentional halo that no one mentioned. he stopped playing. No one asked why. The fire crackled again louder now, as if reclaiming its space. The traveler placed the flute back in its case, tied it shut, and leaned back against the nearest wall with the kind of exhale that suggests a long trip completed, but not quite over. The storyteller, never one to be outdone in slowness, nodded respectfully and picked up the thread again, murmuring that dreams were indeed part of river life, but also part of temple life, and that now might be the time to recall the curious tale of the acolyte who claimed to translate hieroglyphs in his sleep, and the chicken who pecked out prophecies with suspicious accuracy, and how both became briefly famous before vanishing mysteriously just after someone mixed up the ink jars. The tale drifted gently from the last note of the flute, like smoke curling upward from a half-forgotten offering, and the storyteller now comfortably reclined against a woven cushion that had seen both better days and better feathers, began again, this time with a story that hovered on the edge of credibility. Like many temple tales, do not impossible, but more likely on certain moon phases, and with just the right combination of incense and inattention. The acolyte's name was Becket, though he preferred Bach, and was known primarily for two things: having a fondness for dried melon seeds, and the peculiar habit of speaking full sentences in his sleep, often in a voice deeper than his waking one, and occasionally in what sounded like archaic dialects that no longer matched any official prayer scrolls. At first, it was amusing. The other novices made gentle jokes mimicking him during morning floor sweeping or mid-oil stirring. But one night, during a particularly quiet phase of the lunar calendar, Bach was overheard reciting what seemed to be a list of forgotten hieroglyphs, symbols no longer used, but recognizable to the scribe who had been sleeping nearby, a man of such scholarly disposition, he occasionally corrected bird calls. The scribe named Huya recorded the symbols hastily on a reed tablet, using a bit of leftover black ink from the previous solstice ceremony, and the next morning asked Bach what they meant. Bach, still blinking sleep from his eyes and brushing off crumbs of aniseed flatbread, stared blankly. "I dreamed of a staircase made of papyrus," he said, "and a falcon wearing sandals. It wasn't helpful." But the symbols, when shown to a visiting priestess with a taste for linguistic puzzles, loosely translated into something about seasonal winds, lost jars of sesame paste, and the path beneath the path, which could have meant anything or nothing, or perhaps both. Intrigued, the temple elders began a quiet experiment. Each night, Bach was allowed to fall asleep near a fresh tablet and a small ink jar. and each morning, Huya, or another appointed listener, transcribed what he muttered. Over time, patterns emerged. Repetitions, strange grammar, the occasional insult directed at imaginary fish, and then came the night he muttered, "The chicken knows." This might have passed without note had it not been for the chicken in question, a small, scruffy hen known simply as Merit, short for Merit Raheskenemet, which no one ever managed to pronounce correctly, except for one elderly priest with a lisp. Merit had been part of the temple grounds for years, tolerated for her egg-laying, but avoided for her eyes, which were said to be unusually symmetrical and more unsettlingly judgmental. After Bach's pronouncement, Merit became the subject of mild theological debate. Some argued she was merely a bird. Others whispered she might be a vessel of divine knowledge, particularly after she was observed pecking repeatedly at a piece of parchment that had been left out too long in the sun. The parchment, when examined, bore a crude drawing of a lotus and a fish symbols, which in some texts represented rebirth and slippery decisions. Emboldened, someone drew a row of hieroglyphs on flat stones and arranged them in a semicircle, placing a small seed on each. Merit pecked the third from the left, an ideogram representing change or possibly mild disappointment. The observers gasped. From then on, she was consulted before minor decisions, such as whether to increase the fig offerings on festival days, or whether the west-facing gate needed another coat of protective spell paint. Her accuracy was debated. Her confidence was not. Meanwhile, Bach's sleep writing continued. Some nights he mumbled full phrases, others just syllables. Once he chanted the same word, Nebefit, 43 times. Huya noted it consulted a dusty scroll and found it meant winnowing basket, or in a rare dialect, the one who stirs the wind. It was vague enough to be considered prophetic. The real trouble began when someone, no one admitted, who decided to prepare a special ink blend for Bach's sleep-writing sessions. Something more attuned, they claimed, involving crushed beetle shells, lotus soot, and a pinch of powdered resin that had not been labeled clearly in the storeroom. The ink worked in that it darkened quickly and held its color on papyrus. But it also smelled faintly of pickled radish and made the writing shimmer oddly under torchlight. The morning after its first use, Bach awoke to find his hands stained and Huya asleep, with his forehead pressed against the wall, muttering too many doors. The writing from that night, once deciphered, appeared to describe a corridor beneath the temple that no one had mentioned before. Curious, the elders conducted a thorough inspection and found nothing until Merit, entirely unprompted, led a small procession of novices behind the west granary, scratched at the ground with such insistence that a buried slab was uncovered, revealing an ancient step. What lay beneath was, as the storyteller assured his audience, neither treasure nor danger, but something in between, a storage niche with half-rotted jars, fragments of a broken offering plate, and an old sandal, so pristine it was rumored to have belonged to a minor deity of tidiness. Merit was rewarded with sesame seeds. Back was allowed a nap in the shade. The ink was retired. Life resumed, slightly tilted, and as the courtyard listeners blinked at the stars, now blinking back, the storyteller hinted that what happened next after the ink was locked away and the hen refused to peck at any more ideograms was something altogether more puzzling. An afternoon when shadows stood still, the temple's water clock ran backwards for nearly 10 breaths, and a boy claimed the sun had winked at him just as he dropped his first successful bread loaf into the fire. It was sometime between the high stretch of morning and the slow lean of afternoon, when it happened, that peculiar span of hours where time is mostly measured by the shifting weight of shadows and the vague awareness that someone somewhere ought to be stirring something over a fire. The courtyard had grown sleepy, the usual soft noises of temple life, a broom brushing lazily across stone, the occasional clink of amphora being stacked without urgency, formed a gentle rhythm that made even the pigeons pause. But at the edge of the communal oven, where the heat shimmered just enough to blur outlines and encourage reflection, a boy named Pehanu, not especially skilled and only recently trusted to carry flour without supervision, was attempting to bake his first unsupervised loaf. The dough prepared earlier that morning, with the flour he'd spilled slightly less than usual, had risen modestly in the shaded nook beside the herb wall. It was not a perfect loaf, slightly lopsided, overfloured on one edge, and bearing the imprint of a thumb, but it was his, and that made all the difference. He placed it carefully on the flat stone inside the oven, whispered something that might have been a chant or might have been an apology, and stepped back. At that precise moment, the temple's water clock, a large ceramic vessel with a small hole at the bottom, and lines marked for timekeeping, gave an odd gurgle, the sort usually reserved for indigestion or divine intervention, and the water, instead of lowering, seemed to rise by a finger's breadth. No one noticed at first. Huya, the scribe, who had been drowsing in the shade with one eye technically open, was the first to squint at it properly, lifting his head just far enough to observe the shifting waterline. He watched it for a moment, blinked, and then adjusted his position on the bench, as though a different angle might yield a more reasonable explanation. Meanwhile, Pehenu, now watching his loaf with a mixture of pride and cautious dread, noticed something even stranger. The top of the bread, which ought to have browned slightly by now, remained pale. The air smelled warm, yes, and faintly of rosemary from the previous batch, but there was no scent of toasting crust. He leaned in, blinked at the loaf, and that's when it happened. Just a flicker, a sudden shaft of light, unnaturally angled, caught the edge of the oven's opening and danced across the loaf's top like a wink, brief and impossibly specific. He stepped back so quickly he startled a lizard into retreat, and then turned to the sky. The sun, bold and unwavering as ever seemed ordinary, but Pehenu wide-eyed and breathing, as though he'd just raced across the courtyard and won something, was convinced. It winked, he said quietly, to no one and everyone. The sun winked. Several novices nearby exchanged glances. One snorted gently. Another pointed at the loaf. Still raw, she said. But the loaf was not raw. It was warm, very warm, and firm to the touch. When Pehenu, hands trembling slightly, removed it and tapped the bottom, it gave the soft, hollow sound of something properly baked. No scorching, no crackling crust, just a gentle golden color and a faint scent of something not unlike honey, though no honey had been used. The loaf, it seemed, had baked without browning, without burning, and possibly without heat. Word traveled slowly, but persistently. Soon, a small group had gathered, including Tadi, the head priestess, who examined both the bread and the oven, and then closed her eyes for several heartbeats, as if consulting an inner scroll. The water clock still rose. Merritt, the chicken, wandered by, pecked once at a dropped fig stem, and then stared pointedly at the oven before moving on. The old flute man, still resting beneath the date palm, murmured something about solar echoes and declined further explanation. That evening, Huya attempted to document the day's events, but his ink ran unusually thin, and the reed pen bent mid-sentence. Pehenu, after being patted on the head by no fewer than 6 elders, was instructed to rest and not think too hard about the loaf. But he did think about it. He thought about the way the light had shifted, the way the oven had felt, less like a fire and more like a glow, the way the bread had tasted. He'd taken a cautious bite when no one was looking and decided it was very slightly better than usual, though not dramatically so. He also thought about the water clock, which the following day resumed its usual downward measure, without comment. Though someone did notice a new scratch on its inner rim, shaped almost like a lotus petal. No one knew what it meant, or if it meant anything. But for several days, after more people came to sit near the oven, not to bake, but simply to watch, as if expecting something quiet and remarkable might happen again. The loaf itself was offered eventually to the temple altar, placed beside a bowl of lotus seeds and an unusually round pear. The offering was accepted without incident, though a novice later claimed the loaf was gone faster than usual, and that the flame behind the altar flickered green for just a moment as it was consumed. Life resumed. Pehenu was given more baking duties, albeit under supervision. The water clock remained under mild observation. The sun continued rising and setting with its usual precision. But in the shaded corners of the temple, in whispers shared while grinding herbs or mending sandals, some still spoke of the day the sun winked and a loaf baked itself, and how perhaps, just perhaps, the gods were watching, curious, amused, or simply in need of a snack. And just as the story settled like a feather on still air, the storyteller lifted his head again, eyes half-lidded, but voice steady, to reveal that something else had begun shifting, not in the sky or the fire, but in the temple walls themselves, a hairline crack forming just beneath the painted gaze of a crocodile god, and the soft, inexplicable sound of scratching heard from within. It began not loudly, not suddenly, but with the kind of creeping presence that makes itself known only after it's already been there a while, with a sound that was almost a sound, a soft, dry scratching, like a reed across pottery, or a beetle trying very politely to dig a tunnel through a wall that had absolutely no intention of letting it. The sound came from the northern corridor of the temple, just beneath the faded mural of Sobek, the crocodile god of strength, protection, and occasional theatrics. Sobek in this depiction was shown reclining in a boat, wearing a headdress too grand for paddling, and smiling faintly in a way that made everyone vaguely uncomfortable, as if he knew a joke they didn't and wouldn't explain it without a formal request in triplicate. The scratching began during the second morning after the loaf incident, while the sun was still stretching itself across the lintels and the water clock had resumed behaving with the sulky precision of a rebuked child. At first, only Becket noticed it. Becket still recovering from his sleep-writing fame, and now occasionally consulted for dream translations, even when fully awake. He'd gone into the corridor to retrieve a basket of prayer mats left from the last moon chant, and as he bent to pick one up, he heard it, faint, irregular, like the dry tick of beetle legs, or the whisper of sand where sand shouldn't be. He stood, basket clutched a little too tightly, and stared at the wall. The mural was the same as always, Sobek's scales, chipped at the edges. The paint around his snout faded to a gentle seaweed green, one eye slightly higher than the other, as though assessing the viewer. But below, near the line where the plaster met the stone floor, a thin crack had formed, so narrow it could have been mistaken for a brushstroke, but just jagged enough to look unintentional. Beckett, uncertain whether to call for help or pretend nothing was happening, did what most temple novices would do in his place, he told Huya. Huya, whose interest in unusual phenomena had recently been piqued by sleep chickens and prophetic pastries, arrived an hour later with a reed stylus, a small oil lamp, and a piece of flat bread he insisted was for comparison purposes. He knelt beside the crack, pressed his ear to the wall, and nodded once. "It's scratching," he said, calmly, then took a bite of the flatbread. Definitely not mice. Mice, for all their faults, did not scratch rhythmically, and certainly not in patterns that occasionally resembled syllables. Tadi was consulted. She arrived, examined the wall in silence, then instructed 2 acolytes to measure the crack at sunrise, midday, and dusk. "If it grows," she said, "we will consult the elders. If it stops, we will never speak of it again." It grew. Slowly, but unmistakably. By the 3rd day, it had widened by the width of a barley grain. The scratching continued, still faint, still inconsistent, but now accompanied by something worse, the occasional exhale. Not wind, not breath exactly, but the suggestion of something sighing behind the stone, something tired, or curious, or simply exasperated that it had not yet been invited in. The temple adjusted. Offerings were placed nearer to Sobek's mural. Prayers were said with extra emphasis on protection and polite distance. Merit the chicken was brought in and allowed to peck near the base of the wall. She stared for several minutes, pecked once, and then walked away with what one novice described as deliberate disapproval. That evening, a meeting was held. The storyteller, who by now had become a fixture near the courtyard fire, was asked to recount any legends involving whispering walls, crocodile deities with itchy temperaments, or architectural features that spoke. He nodded, thoughtfully, sipped his water, and began a tale about a village where the walls grew ears during planting season, and a statue of a frog once demanded its own bedroom. The elders were not reassured. On the 7th day, the wall exhaled again, louder this time, and the crack widened just enough to reveal a sliver of something darker than shadow, darker than plaster, darker than anything one would willingly reach into. No one did. That night, Beckett dreamed of Sobek, not majestic, not regal, but grumpy, soaked, and muttering about misplaced offerings and an inconvenient lack of fish. When he awoke, the water jar beside his bed was half empty and smelled faintly of riverweed. Huya documented everything. He even began a new scroll titled On Subtle Temple Disruptions and Their Preferred Methods of Communication, which he illustrated with increasingly wild doodles of fish wearing hats. Toddy, after much consideration, ordered a single reed mat placed over the crack each night as a gesture of respectful boundary setting. The scratching quieted. The exhale became softer, almost a hum. And the mural of Sobek. His smile seemed perhaps just a little less knowing, though that may have been the light. Still, the temple grew quieter. The bread returned to browning properly. The chicken stopped offering unsolicited advice. And in that fragile calm, the storyteller warned another event stirred not in stone or shadow, but in the records themselves, where a set of temple census scrolls was discovered to contain names of people no one remembered, occupations no one had held, and a date that had not yet happened, written in ink, no one claimed to have used. They found the scroll while cleaning out the third archive alcove, the one behind the old incense store where scorpions liked to congregate in pairs, and no one ventured without sandals thick enough to inspire confidence. The scroll, unusually crisp and wrapped in linen that hadn't frayed, was nestled between two brittle records of grain allotments for festivals long past and a half-finished inventory of ceremonial spoons. At first glance, it looked like any other administrative document, rows of names, brief titles, small notations in a script so tidy it bordered on smug. Huya was the one who found it. Of course, since he had recently taken it upon himself to update the archive's miscellaneous persons and slightly confusing objects section. He unrolled it carefully, muttering his usual preamble about ink consistency and papyrus grain, and then stopped. The first thing he noticed was a name Nenedjem familiar. Yes, but also wrong. Nenedjem had died 3 years ago after a tragic incident involving spoiled lentils and a poorly timed sneeze. Yet here he was listed as Lantern Whisperer, a position no one had ever heard of, but which somehow sounded strangely plausible. Next was a woman named Iset Peru, assigned the role of supervisor of moonlight directions. She had never worked at the temple, never lived in the district, and as far as anyone could tell, had never existed at all. But her name was written in the official hand in official ink, and accompanied by a tiny drawing of what might have been a moon compass or a decorative egg. The scroll continued with similar oddities, a listener of rain echoes, a custodian of forgotten handles, and most perplexing, a deputy of unhappened winds, all listed alongside ritual dates and annotations in future tenses. The final entry was the most unsettling, the return of Sobek's patience, mid-flood, year yet to be. It was dated with a glyph sequence not seen in any known calendar, positioned just above a note reading, "Preparations, satisfactory, pending compliance of the wall." The wall. The one beneath Sobek's mural. The one that had been breathing. Huya took the scroll to Tadi immediately. She read it once, then twice, then asked for tea. When the tea arrived, she drank it silently and requested that Huya not mention the scroll to anyone not currently employed by the temple or capable of identifying at least 3 types of ceremonial soot. That night, the scroll was placed inside a clay jar, which was then sealed and set atop a shelf in the very center of the archive, directly beneath the small stone idol of Thoth, known to blink suspiciously during thunderstorms. But the jar didn't stay still. Twice, it was found slightly turned, once upside down, and once balanced precariously on the rim of the shelf, as if someone or something had picked it up, reconsidered, and put it back with mild irritation. Meanwhile, Beckett began dreaming again, this time of names spoken slowly in a voice like dripping water. He would wake with phrases in his mouth, moonward custodian, jar turner, of deliberate delay, and no memory of speaking them. Huya resumed writing notes. He even invented a new ink blend he called Precautious Gray. The chickens avoided the archive entirely. The scroll's strangeness wasn't limited to its contents. One morning, it unrolled itself. No one saw it happen, but the linen tie was found resting beside it, folded in a manner no temple worker ever used. The last time Huya checked it, a new entry had appeared, Beckett Interim Recorder of what is not yet known. Beckett, upon hearing this, dropped the bowl he was carrying and claimed he felt a bit inside out. The temple began to shift again. Not visibly, not in ways that tourists would notice, but in the hush of certain corners, in the way sounds echoed too long or too short, in the subtle fact that shadows near Sobek's mural now lingered even after their casters walked away. A novice whispered that her sandals had begun squeaking in patterns. An elder found a bowl of lentils alphabetized by shape. Merritt the chicken laid 2 eggs in one day, each marked with a faint spiral. No one admitted to painting them. Tadi, ever measured, ever rational, called a gathering at dusk. The fire crackled more than usual. The pond gurgled in polite anticipation. She held the scroll in her hands, not unrolled not read aloud, and announced that the temple would proceed with caution as it always had, and that the presence of speculative documentation was no reason to panic. However, she added, "If your name appears on this scroll in the future, do let someone know." There were nods, small ones, nervous ones. Pehenu, watching from the back, whispered that he hoped his future title wasn't loaf, reluctantly devoured by time. That got a chuckle, though no one laughed loudly. That evening, the storyteller paused his tale. Let the scroll rest in the minds of his listeners, and mentioned that the story would now shift gently, like sand turning in sleep, to the peculiar account of a wind that arrived, without notice, spent an entire day refusing to move anything heavier than a feather, and carried whispers from cities no longer on maps. It was the kind of morning that began with stillness. Not the sleepy, satisfied kind, but the sort that feels like the air is holding its breath, as if something just happened or is about to, and no one wants to move until it's sure which. The temple birds who normally squawked through breakfast preparations with the enthusiasm of unpaid announcers had gone quiet. Even Merritt, the chicken, usually pecking with judgment, by dawn sat motionless atop a low wall, feathers slightly puffed, eyes following something that wasn't quite visible. Huya was the first to notice the wind, though he didn't call it wind at first. He said it was a curious current, the way one might describe soup that had started to taste like questions. It moved through the courtyard, softly, too softly for dust, but strong enough to lift the edge of scrolls, turn sandals slightly askew, and tease loose threads from robes. It did not bend reeds. It did not sway the palms. It passed right over jugs of water without disturbing the surface. And yet, every single feather in the temple on birds' cushions, ceremonial fans, twitched as if struck by a very polite suggestion. Beckett, who had not dreamed that night and was already feeling slightly off because of it, stepped outside carrying a bundle of prayer cords and immediately dropped half of them. Not from surprise, but because a small, cool breeze had tickled the back of his ear and whispered, "Turn." He turned. No one was there. Pehenu, on his way to check the baking pits, found the warm coals cool, and a line of ash shaped exactly like the sigil for maybe later. The incense burners relit themselves with less smoke than usual. And somewhere near the storeroom, where the census scroll was still under heavy observation, a single feather from an ibis floated upward, hovered briefly, then floated back down in the exact same place it started. It was Toddy, who finally said, "We're being visited," though she did not clarify by what. That afternoon, Huya attempted to map the wind's behavior. He placed small pieces of shredded parchment across the courtyard, each marked with a symbol for direction, and watched them for 3 hours. None of them moved, but he swore one disappeared entirely, and another reappeared with an unfamiliar word written on it, else when. At the same time, the temple's sundial cast a shadow in the correct place, but at the wrong time, reading midday when it was clearly early morning. A nearby goat sneezed. The wind kept moving, never forcefully, never cold, but with the persistence of a thought you've forgotten but can't stop almost remembering. People began to hear things, not voices, not exactly, but fragments, echoes in a language that tugged at recognition without resolving. One novice trying to refill the oil lamps stopped and said aloud, "Why does the air say Zemhat? That's not a month anymore." Tadi summoned the oldest record keeper, a man who'd once catalogued a star's blink and retired for a week from the effort. He flipped slowly through his own dusty memories, finally declaring that Zemhat was long ago a month reserved for preparations in a city no longer listed in any modern maps. Its walls were square, he added, but the streets weren't. He then returned to chewing dried lotus root and refused further commentary. The wind, it turned out, wasn't just lifting feathers. It was lifting memories, forgotten duties, misplaced calendars. At one point, the bells at the outer gate rang once, not from touch, not from wind, but as if responding to something passing by that used to matter deeply. The scroll with the future occupations trembled slightly in its jar. Merritt the chicken laid a single feather in the offering bowl and walked away. That evening, as the sun dipped lower than usual before actually setting, the storyteller gathered the listeners with less effort than ever before. They came willingly, quietly, as though they too had heard their names whispered from a year that hadn't yet begun. There is, the storyteller said, a tale of a wind that once circled cities, which have since stopped being cities. Places that remain on maps only because no one's had the heart to remove them. This wind carried lullabies sung before language had rules. It nudged doors in forgotten temples and played games with birds that no longer migrated. And on one very specific afternoon, it reached here. He paused. The fire, freshly stoked, popped a single coal into the air. They say, he continued, that if you stand very still when it passes, if you let it move your hair, but not your heart, you might catch the name of a place that used to know you. Not your current name, not the one on your scroll, but the one you had when sandals were new, and papyrus hadn't yet been invented. The listeners didn't speak, A few nodded very slowly. The wind continued brushing the outer wall of the temple, slipping past the pond with a ripple that wasn't caused by fish. And somewhere in the darker part of the archive, behind the incense stones, and beside the jar, labeled unknown fragments, mostly harmless, a new scroll appeared. No one saw it arrive, but it was there, still warm to the touch, and on it, one line written in soft brown ink. Tomorrow the wall will listen back. The scroll that appeared behind the incense stones had no title, no seal, no identifying features other than the single line in soft brown ink that read, "Tomorrow, the wall will listen back, and for reasons no one could explain, not even Huya, who once delivered a 30-minute lecture on the migratory patterns of ink viscosity, it felt important not to move it. So they didn't. Tadi, after a moment of breath-holding thought, placed a small bowl of sand beside it, muttered a short phrase that may have been protective or may have been a recipe, and instructed everyone to just see what happens. This was not standard temple procedure. Normally, a scroll of unknown origin would be catalogued, copied lightly, perfumed, and placed in a viewing niche under polite guard. But this one was treated like an animal, not yet identified, approached slowly, spoken around, and occasionally offered dried fruit. That night, the wind finally stopped, not gradually, not fading, but as if someone had placed a large hand over the temple and said, "Hush." The air went still. The reeds held their breath. Even the pond, fond of its gurgles, went quiet. Morning came too bright, too sharp. Shadows formed with unusual crispness. No one overslept, not because they were eager, but because they had all already woken individually, without arrangement, at the same breath of dawn. Baket was the first to speak to the wall, not by choice. He was sweeping the corridor beneath Sobek's mural, just as he had 100 times before when the bristles of his broom caught the edge of the crack. It wasn't larger, but it wasn't the same. The plaster around it felt warmer than stone ought to. It hummed. Not a noise exactly, more a suggestion of resonance, like a bowl that remembers being struck, or a note that refuses to leave a room. He leaned close. The wall whispered. No words. Just breath pattern, something almost language. He stepped back too quickly, hit the broom against the opposite wall, and startled 2 passing goats into a trot. Within an hour, the corridor was filled not with alarm, but with quiet anticipation. Huya brought 5 different scrolls for reference. Tadi brought incense that hadn't been burned in years. Its label faded to just the word maybe. Pehenu brought a small loaf, mostly out of habit, and the storyteller brought nothing. Only his voice, which was deemed sufficient. One by one, they approached the wall. Not all heard it. Some said it murmured. Others felt only a vibration, a lightness behind the eyes, like a word stuck on the tip of the temple's tongue. The mural of Sobek remained unchanged, but his painted smile, once crooked and mildly condescending, seemed to level. It no longer looked like a smirk. It looked like patience. At midday, the scroll with the brown ink changed. No one touched it. No one saw the moment it happened. But where before there had been one line, now there were two. Tomorrow, the wall will listen back remained. Beneath it now, then it will remember. This was unsettling, not because of what it said, but because of the implication that forgetting had already occurred. That something once known to the wall, and perhaps to the temple itself, had been put aside, stored like an unused jar, sealed, and labeled in a language no longer in style. That evening, as the lamps were lit, and the sky softened into the color of cooling ash, Merritt, the chicken, stood near the wall, fluffed herself twice, pecked once at the base, and walked away. The storyteller sat in the same spot he always had, firelight licking the edges of his robe, and spoke of a time when temples were more than stone, when walls were not just boundaries, but lungs, breathers of memory, and whisperers of old agreements. The wall, he said, was not built to hold things out, but to hold things in. Things we promised not to forget. No one asked what had been forgotten. No one wanted to guess. But just as the fire flickered and someone passed around a bowl of toasted seeds in silence, a sound came from the wall. Not scratching, not sighing, but three distinct thumps, soft, rhythmic, like a heart, considering whether or not to wake up. The sound stopped. Then a new voice, young perhaps, or old, pretending to be young, spoke clearly from behind the plaster. Just two words, almost ready. Silence followed. Not fearful, not heavy, just silence that waited for someone to answer. No one did. Not yet. But in the archive, where the scrolls rested under layers of dust and reverence, another appeared half unrolled, stained slightly, with something resembling pomegranate juice, and written in tight script at the top were 6 names, 5 known and 1 missing, followed by the phrase, "When the 6th remembers, the door will open." The scroll with the 6 names, 5 written in precise ink. The 6th space left empty. save for a faint swirl of ink, like a thought that hadn't finished. Arriving. Sat unrolled on the archive table longer than anyone intended. Huya hovered near it for the better part of an afternoon, muttering occasionally to himself and trying with increasing exasperation to determine if the smudge at the end was the beginning of a name or simply the accidental trail of an elbow. Tadi stared at it once for nearly an hour without blinking, then stood and walked outside to rearrange the sandals near the outer gate, which hadn't been touched since the last time the wall whispered. Pehenu offered bread. No one accepted. It was a fine loaf, but the air in the archive had taken on a texture that made chewing feel impolite. Backet, once again, the accidental center of things, had not been near the scroll since the second thump from the wall. He'd taken to sitting in the outer courtyard near the fig tree that leaned slightly too far to one side, quietly weaving and unweaving lengths of cord. The act calmed him. It also seemed to draw small gusts of wind that no one else felt. He didn't notice. His thoughts were tangled in names, not new names, but old ones, names that came in dreams, now less frequently, but more vividly. They arrived like warm cloth across the shoulders, familiar, comforting, heavy with meaning, and slipped away again before he could form the syllables. He began writing fragments in the dust with a twig. None of them stayed. The sixth name remained missing. Merritt the chicken had stopped laying eggs altogether. Instead, she had taken to sitting in front of the archive door each morning, as if guarding it, though, from what remained unclear. Occasionally, she pecked at the ground 3 times in rapid succession, and then turned in a circle. This was noted. Everything was noted now. Even the angle of sunbeams was charted, especially on the western wall, where someone had discovered that the crack beneath Sobek's mural cast a shadow shaped almost like a key during the last hour of daylight. The shape was uneven and wavered with the breeze, but it formed consistently enough that Huya began sketching it every afternoon with increasing suspicion. "That's not plaster," he declared one evening after poking at the crack with a reed stylus and receiving a soft hum in return. "That's listening stone. That's designed to hold memory." No one challenged this. By now, memory was as much a presence in the temple as fire water and the occasional goat intrusion. That night, the storyteller did not wait for the fire to be built. He simply began speaking as the sun dipped his words, drifting like smoke, even in the absence of smoke. "There is," he said, "a tale of a name that forgot itself, not because it was lost, but because it chose to wait. It was once spoken too often, so it hid in silence until it was needed again." He paused, letting the wind make a half-hearted attempt at stirring the hem of his robe. And it is said that when the 5 remember the 6th, and the 6th remembers being remembered, the wall will offer more than whispers. The listeners didn't ask who the 5 were. They all suspected. Not names, but shapes, roles. The recorder, the baker, the dreamer, the listener, the keeper of what shouldn't be moved. 5. The 6th unnamed, unseen, but felt. That was the strange part. Everyone felt it, like a presence just beyond the next breath, like someone about to enter a room and never quite doing so. Then, just before the fire was lit that night, a thud came from the archive, not loud, but decisive. Inside the scroll with the 6 names had shifted slightly. The 5th name now glowed faintly, as if warming from within. The 6th space remained blank, but beneath it, new words had appeared almost shy. It waits in the name you do not speak. Beckett, sitting under the fig tree, looked up suddenly. Not at the sound, not at the scroll, but at the mural of Sobek far across the courtyard. He stood, slowly, as though remembering how, and began walking. Not quickly, not purposefully, but with the steady rhythm of someone answering a call they hadn't realized was theirs. Behind him, the wind stirred quiet but persistent. It passed over the stones, lifted the edge of a papyrus sheet, resting near Huya's elbow, and carried with it a scent, not incense, not river, but something older. Something like the breath of stone that once dreamed it was a door. Beckett's steps made no sound, or at least none that carried through the courtyard, though a few heads turned as he passed, not out of recognition, but from that odd instinct one feels when something slightly out of time walks by the same sensation. One gets when a shadow doesn't quite match its source, or a breeze changes direction halfway through a sentence. He crossed the stones with hands at his sides, not clenched, not open, just present, and stopped before the mural of Sobek, without touching it. The painted eyes stared back, one slightly more smudged than the other, and the crack below, thinner than a reed's whisper, pulsed faintly in the golden wash of late afternoon. Huya had paused mid-note. Tadi stood near the edge of the colonnade, arms folded, but not in judgment, only in waiting. The storyteller, still seated near the fire pit that had not yet been lit, tilted his head as though listening for a sound too high for anyone else to hear. The wind, which had spent most of the day hiding among papyrus stacks and whispering to candle flames, slipped around Beckett's ankles, like a cat deciding whether or not to stay. Then came the breath. Not from Beckett, not from any living mouth, It issued from the wall, not loud, not sharp, just long and low and steady, like the first exhale after remembering something important and deeply buried. The mural seemed to shift, not visibly, but undeniably. The lines of paint settled. The uneven smile of Sobek smoothed into something closer to welcome, or perhaps resignation. And then Beckett knelt, slowly. Not in deference, but as one might crouch beside a stream to listen more clearly. He placed his palm flat against the floor where the shadow key landed each evening, and at that moment the last ray of sunlight cut across the courtyard and touched the wall. The crack pulsed. There was a sound not unlike a sigh, but layered as though stone and air and memory had all exhaled at once. The floor beneath Beckett's hand warmed. The wind stopped. For a moment, it felt as if the temple had blinked. Then the mural shimmered, not changed, not moved, but revealed. Beneath the paint, a shape emerged, a door. Not large, not grand, just a rectangle of stone, so flush with the wall, it had been hidden in plain view, its edges worn smooth by centuries of being almost remembered. The sixth name, the unnamed one, flickered into being on the scroll, still resting in the archive, its letters unfolding, not like ink, but like breath made visible. It said, Nebt Hu, a name so old it predated the temple's current dedication. A name once whispered during rituals, long fallen out of practice, a name spoken to walls, not people. Beckett whispered it, once, softly, and the wall moved, not opened, not cracked, just moved, like a sleeping animal, shifting in its dreams. A small panel slid downward, revealing not a staircase, nor a tunnel, nor even a chamber, but a hollow, round and shallow, lined with polished stone, and filled with still air that smelled of old rain and warm reeds. Inside the hollow sat a vessel, simple, unadorned, shaped like a lidded bowl, its clay smooth and dappled with tiny flecks of something that might once have been gold, or simply thought it was. Tadi approached slowly, stopping beside Beckett. She did not ask if he was all right. Instead, she said, "It's listening," and he nodded. "It remembers," he replied. The vessel did not hum, did not glow. It simply was. A container of something not meant to be forgotten. Behind them, the wind returned, not the teasing, feather-lifting sort from before. This wind was still contained, like the hush inside a scroll jar, or the moment just before a bell is rung. The rest of the temple held its breath. The chickens had gone silent. The water clock, forgotten by the wall near the southern colonnade, had begun dripping backwards again, one drop every few heartbeats, each echoing slightly too long. The storyteller, now standing, stepped forward. "This is the part," he said, "where the temple tells its version." And even before the listeners could ask what that meant, the floor beneath the mural gave a gentle shudder, and a second shape appeared beside the vessel, an inscription in the floor, carved clean, as if by fresh hands, in a language no longer spoken, but still understood. It read, "For the sixth to know the first, the vessel must be opened in silence before moonlight touches stone." No one moved. The sun had nearly dipped. The moon would rise soon. And the silence that settled then was not fear, nor awe, but agreement. As if every stone, every scroll, every forgotten name had finally reached a consensus. The time to remember had arrived, and the temple at last was ready to speak. The moment stretched, not like time, but like fabric pulled gently taut between what had been and what was just about to be. No one spoke. Even Huya, whose fingers were itching for a stylus, held still. The inscription on the floor, newly revealed and startlingly crisp, despite the centuries it must have waited beneath the mural of Sobek, remained clear. For the sixth to know the first, the vessel must be opened in silence before moonlight touches stone. The sun, meanwhile, had not yet fully disappeared. It hovered low and wide, bleeding soft amber along the edge of the courtyard, and casting the faintest blush on the wall where the crack had been, where the door had emerged, where now the vessel sat quiet as a breath waiting to be exhaled. Bucket rose from his crouch slowly, as if his limbs had to negotiate their return to standing. He glanced at Toddy, who nodded once. Pehenu, halfway behind a column, clutched a small, perfectly adequate loaf, and watched with the wide-eyed awe normally reserved for solar eclipses and unusually large insects. Beckett stepped toward the hollow. The vessel looked unassuming up close, modest and deliberate, in shape the kind of thing one might overlook, if not for the way it didn't reflect light so much as soften it. He reached out with both hands, not rushed, not trembling, and lifted the lid. No wind escaped. No glow. No sound. Just a moment of stillness so deep it seemed to echo as though silence itself had dropped a stone into a well of silence. Inside was not treasure, not relic, not scroll. It was sand. Just sand. Fine-grained, pale, and faintly warm, as though it had remembered the sun from many suns ago. At first, no one reacted. Then, Huya cleared his throat in the gentlest possible manner and leaned forward. "Memory sand," he whispered, "not so much as a fact, but a suggestion." Tadi knelt beside the vessel and extended a finger. She hesitated, then touched the surface. The sand didn't shift. Instead, it rippled inward, as though absorbing the contact, and then for just an instant, the vessel hummed, not audibly, but in a way the bones could feel a vibration that brushed the edge of the senses. A single grain of sand lifted into the air. It hovered, then glided gently toward Beckett. He held out his palm. The grain settled in the center. Nothing happened, or rather, nothing explosive, but something began. Beckett's eyes closed, not by choice, but by invitation. And then he remembered. Not his own memories, not entirely. These were older. He saw a courtyard shaped slightly differently, its stones newer, brighter. He saw hands shaping the vessel. Not his hands. Steady hands. Purposeful. He saw Sobek not as mural, but as presence, towering, yet calm, amused, yet solemn, nodding once at something Beckett could not hear. He saw 5 others' figures, blurry, and shifting, each turning to him, not with recognition, but with expectation. And then he saw a name. His name. Not Beckett. Not exactly. A name with curves and error in it. Nebetu. It felt right. Like stepping into a robe that had always been his, but worn by others while he had forgotten it. He opened his eyes. Tadi was watching him, her face unreadable, but still. "You remember," she said, not asking. He nodded. "Some of it," he replied. "Enough." He turned to the vessel. The sand had settled again, now cool and still. But something else had changed. The stone beneath the vessel, once smooth, now bore an imprint, as if the vessel had stamped its memory onto the temple itself. A spiral coiled inward. A map or a key, or perhaps just a direction. Huya leaned in. "It leads somewhere," he murmured. "Not here, not now, but somewhere." The storyteller, quiet until now, stepped into the edge of the space hands behind his back. "The 6th was not the end," he said softly. "The 6th was the hinge. Now the temple will remember the 1st." The others looked at him. "What was the 1st?" Pehenu whispered. The storyteller didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, the temple itself responded. A low thrum rising from the floor, from the walls, from the spaces, between the spaces. Not threatening, not loud, but insistent. A call. From somewhere deeper than stone, older than murals, softer than sand. Beneath them, somewhere not far, but long, a mechanism stirred, ancient, slow, and deliberate. Something beneath the temple began to turn. The vessel pulsed once, and the sand inside shimmered faintly as a second spiral, smaller than the first, appeared at the base of the hollow, carved so delicately it might have been drawn by light itself. A path, a start. And just as the first silver sliver of moonlight kissed the corner of stone, the lid lifted slightly, without touch, and whispered, "One more." The whisper echoed in a way that whispers shouldn't, not through air, but through intention, rippling across the courtyard, with the gentleness of steam rising from warm fig broth. "One more," it had said, with neither urgency nor hesitation, simply fact. The vessel's lid, still slightly ajar, hovered as if held aloft by thought alone. The sand inside memory sand, as Huya had declared, with such solemnity that even the more skeptical temple cat had blinked approvingly, had settled into a subtle spiral, mirrored now by the newly revealed etching. Beneath it, a smaller, tighter pattern that turned in the opposite direction, a detail no one would have noticed had the vessel not shifted itself slightly, just enough to draw the eye. Baquette, still kneeling, blinked slowly as the sound faded. It hadn't entered his ears so much as settled behind them, like a forgotten tune hummed in the quiet before dawn. He reached forward, not touching the lid, not yet, just observing the way it hovered, as if uncertain whether its work was done. "One more," he murmured, not as a question, but as a thought he was trying to place. Tadi stepped beside him. "One more," what she asked softly. No one answered immediately. Huya was already scribbling notes, his stylus moving fast enough to produce a faint squeaking noise. Pehenu had quietly placed his latest loaf on the offering slab unbidden, but the gesture felt appropriate. Even Merritt the chicken had wandered to the edge of the gathering and was watching the vessel with the sort of quiet contemplation usually reserved for suspicious grains. The storyteller arms folded, nodded, as though he had expected exactly this, but was still mildly impressed. "If the sixth was the hinge," he said at last, "then the seventh is the motion." The others turned toward him, but he offered no more. Instead, the vessel responded. The sand inside stirred not much, not dramatically, but with purpose. It began to rise in a slow spiral, the grains lifting one by one, as if climbing a staircase too old to remember where it led. At the spiral's center, a faint glow began to form. Not bright, not hot, but warm, like breath, against skin. A shape coalesced, not solid, not smoke, but something in between, a figure perhaps, or a memory, pretending to be one. The glow hovered above the vessel for a long moment. Then, very clearly, a second whisper came. Where is the first? The silence that followed was not empty. It brimmed. The question was not accusatory. It was simply unfinished. A thread awaiting the next stitch. Beckett felt the answer not in words, but in weight. His body leaned forward slightly, drawn not by will, but by alignment. The first, the one before the temple, before Sobek's mural, before memory had a place to rest. His fingers brushed the edge of the vessel, and the glow moved toward him, not into him, but around him, circling once, twice, then slipping downward, passing through the stone as though drawn to something hidden. The spiral on the floor flared briefly, then dimmed. Beneath them, deeper than before, another sound began. A soft grinding, like stone shifting after a long nap. The floor, near the vessel, cracked, not violently, but precisely. A seam formed, shaped not in straight lines, but in curves, mimicking the spiral's motion. Slowly the stone peeled back, revealing a descending tunnel, perfectly round the walls, smooth and faintly luminescent, with the kind of light one doesn't see, but simply notices has been there the whole time. Tadi looked to Beckett. He looked to the spiral. "I think it's time," he said, though no one had asked. The vessel remained still. Its glow faded, now the sand calm again. The inscription on the floor had vanished. In its place, a single word had appeared, formed of symbols older than any scroll in the archive, but instantly understood. Begin. Huya, unusually silent, tucked his notes under his arm and stood. Pehenu, having quietly removed his sandals, stepped forward. "Is this where we all remember?" he asked, not expecting an answer. Tadi nodded. "It's where we remember to remember," she said. They gathered at the mouth of the tunnel. The air that rose from it was neither cool nor warm, but familiar, like the scent of a room once lived in long since emptied and suddenly opened again. From deep within came a sound, not a voice, not an echo, but a rhythm, a heartbeat. The temples. And then, just before Beckett could take the first step downward, the storyteller placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "This will not be a journey through darkness. The light down there is older than shadow." And with that, they began to descend one by one into the spiral below, where memory was not a story told, but a path walked, and the seventh piece waited, not as an answer, but as a question, finally ready to be asked. The descent began without ceremony. No chants or ritual drum beats, only the soft padding of feet on the curved stone floor, echoing slightly in the round tunnel that bent ever so gently with each step, as if the path itself was deciding the pace. The walls glowed faintly, not from torches or lanterns, but from a quiet luminescence woven into the stone like the remnants of old dreams or the afterglow of long whispered stories. The further they walked, the softer the world above became, until even the sound of the temple courtyard, a place once filled with the rhythm of sandals, clucks, and the sighs of old scrolls turning faded, entirely replaced by the steady hush of memory folding inward. Beckett led, not because he had volunteered, but because the spiral seemed to expect him to. Behind him came Tadi Huya Pehanu, still barefoot, now carrying a second slightly lopsided loaf, just in case the storyteller, and of course Merritt the chicken, who had followed them without question, and now walked with the solemn grace of one who understood far more than she intended to admit. The path turned again gradually, narrowing, not to a point of discomfort, but intimacy, bringing the group closer, their shadows merging into one long, moving ripple along the walls. And then, just when the air began to smell faintly of stone, warmed by intention, they reached a threshold, not a door, not a gate, but an opening marked by a single vertical line etched into the wall, simple and silent. Beckett paused. The line shimmered, pulsed once like the last blink of a very old eye, and then faded. Beyond was a chamber, round like the spiral itself, and empty, except for a single object in the center, a stone basin, shallow and wide, filled not with water nor sand, but with something between the two, a liquid memory substance that seemed to shift and hold form all at once like thought made visible. The basin pulsed gently with each heartbeat in the room, aligning itself to their presence without demanding it. Tadi stepped forward, head tilted. "This is the remembering place," she said, more to the air than to the group. Huya began scribbling again, though his hand moved slower now reverently. Pehenu whispered something to the loaf and placed it gently beside the basin. The chicken did not cluck. Instead, she sat near the edge and watched the substance with one eye half closed. The basin shimmered, and from it rose a sound soft tonal, neither music nor voice, but the suggestion of both. It carried weight, though not the kind that bends the back more the kind that lifts something off the chest, an almost memory inviting itself in. Then the surface of the liquid shifted, and images began to form. Not pictures, not clear scenes, but moments, echoes of what had come before the first name spoken in the temple's heart, the first prayer offered without words, the first stone laid with hands that trembled from reverence, not labor. They watched as figures formed and faded, each one familiar without being known. One bore Baket's shape, though younger and older at once. Another had Tadi's patience etched into its posture. A third moved like Huya, all careful curiosity. The figures surrounded the basin in the image, just as the group did now. The spiral had turned inward, and now it turned outward again. The seventh piece, the one the vessel had whispered about, was not a person, nor an object. It was the act of remembering together, the unity of shared silence, of witnessed memory. The basin did not show futures. It did not speak of what would come. It showed what was always there, waiting beneath the day's noise. Then, as one, the group stepped forward, each placing a hand on the rim of the basin. The liquid shifted again. It reflected their faces, not as they were now, but as they had been across echoes, each face layered with subtle differences, hints of other lives lived near other temples, beneath other skies. And then it settled. In the center of the basin, a single word formed. Again. The spiral complete, the story paused. The chamber did not close, the light did not fade. Instead, the walls shimmered, as if breathing. The air filled not with revelation, but with steadiness. There was more to remember. Always more. The seventh, it turned out, was not an ending. It was the reminder that even memory must be practiced, shared, tended to like a lamp that flickers unless watched kindly. The storyteller, smiling gently now, whispered, "This is where the temple begins to remember itself." And just then, from far above, where the mural of Sobek still watched with one eye slightly higher than the other, came a soft sound, the echo of water meeting stone, and the thrum of something very old beginning to turn once more.